I'm curious to hear about your general approach to evaluating data and research. How do you decide what's legit, what may be overly influenced by pharmaceutical interests and funding? And then how do you go about making clinical decisions based on the research when oftentimes there's multiple groups of high profile researchers disagreeing on how to assess and evaluate the same set of data?
That's a great question. And you're talking about how we can be certain about what we read. So we all can read things. We can read that such and such causes cancer, and that's great. But what we really want to know is how certain are we about that? Rather than think how certain I am that something is true, I've just changed the definition of truth to be a statistical concept. So there never is any total truth. I'm instead of asking, is someone bipolar or not? Is this medication working or not? I don't ask that. I just ask, what is the likelihood? How well do they fit?
Somebody get this guy some help!
Or, put more simply,
If you need help like this guy, call your own doctor.
Hey everyone, I wanted to take a minute prior to the release of this two-part series with Dr. Chris Aiken to emphasize the importance of our conversation and his philosophies on psychiatry in the context of the grander scope of the current state of mental and medical health care in the U.S. and abroad. We, as in treatment prescribers, whether it be doctors, nurse practitioners, physician's assistants, psychologists, or others, are being fed these scientific dogmas in our training, taught that there is this one way of practicing medicine or psychiatry safely and effectively, promoting management of symptom of disease rather than actively engaging in discussions on prevention of disease, told that data produced by companies that stand to benefit from the very drugs that they are objectively researching is infallible and indisputable, that if we stray from these industry-sponsored guidelines, we are subject to professional and legal scrutiny and liability, that if we question their merit, we should be rallied against and intellectually canceled by their promoted authorities, that folks like Dr. Aiken or myself, considering and working to treat root causes or contributors to our patients' illnesses, constantly trying to better understand and reframe what we call depression or anxiety or severe mental illness, and utilizing natural remedies alongside traditional Western medications, are practicing pseudoscience. The reality is, all science is imperfect. All data is subject to question. All drawn conclusions should be debated and scrutinized by independent scientists, clinicians, and researchers that disagree with each other and have the ability to sit around a table or sit on a Zoom call and respectfully differ in their assessments of what the research and what the data signifies. Good data serves as a guide, but we must maintain a constant, nagging voice of skepticism and openness to being wholly or partially incorrect in our appraisals of what we think we know, so we don't miss a new piece of understanding that might fundamentally alter how we perceived a problem previously. We must be open to even our most neurotic patients and providers' reports of their experiences. Not accept everything we hear as a fact, but accept it as something that could be factual. That's why this conversation is important. That's what Chris Aiken brings to the table. That's what big pharma data and marketing lacks at times. Not because they're bad people, or bad companies. Not to say there aren't bad people in bad companies, but also not to say everyone in that industry operates in the same way. But the reality is they are trying to sell us a product. They are trying to sell us hope about the newest technologies. And I hate seeing us repeatedly fall victim to overhyped promises about effectiveness and to this false sense of security that a 6 or an 8-week randomized controlled trial proves long-term safety and efficacy. I would urge and encourage trainees and young practitioners, as well as the general public, to put time, energy, and effort into learning how to appraise data, how to appreciate varying degrees of certainty with what works and what's safe. And Dr. Aiken provides some fundamental philosophies on how to best approach the litany of data we're exposed to on an everyday basis as clinicians, as patients, and as Americans exposed to direct-to-consumer advertising of pharmaceutical products. Hope everyone enjoys our conversation, learns from it, and grows and evolves in their abilities as clinical providers and as patients asking tough and critical questions of those providers. If you want more on Dr. Aiken's philosophies, check out the Carlett Psychiatry Report. It provides an absolute treasure trove of data, research in psychiatry, without you feeling like you're being force-fed conclusions to draw from that data. Thanks again for engaging. Hope you enjoy. I am very excited today to have on Dr. Chris Aiken, a psychiatrist specializing in mood disorders and emphasizing treatments that enhance long-term brain health. He's most familiar to me because he serves as the editor-in-chief of the Carlett Psychiatry Report and hosts its weekly podcast, a publication free from pharmaceutical industry funding and widely recognized as one of, if not the best, psychiatry podcasts for trainees and young and experienced practitioners. Dr. Aiken is also adjunct assistant professor in the Department of Psychiatry at NYU Grossman School of Medicine. You got your medical degree from Yale, and did you do your residency there as well?
No, residency at Cornell and Duke.
As an author, Dr. Aiken has written books focusing on natural therapies for mood disorders, including Bipolar, Not So Much, Understanding Your Mood Swings and Depression. He also contributes to clinical trials aimed at identifying new treatments for mood disorders. And in his clinical practice, he integrates biologic psychiatry into lifestyle interventions such as diet, light therapy, and sleep optimization, all in order to improve mental health outcomes. Working at the Mood Treatment Center, the director of the Mood Treatment Center in Winston-Salem.
Not anymore. I've changed. I direct Psych Partners now.
On a more personal note, as a trainee, it was tremendously useful to have the Carlett Report, later the Carlett Psychiatry Podcast, as an extracurricular resource during my clinical training. I really appreciate several aspects of how you engage with your listeners, including the nuance and skepticism that you inject into discussions around psychiatric research findings, and not trying to tell other practitioners how to practice, but rather sticking to the findings, the scientific evidence, how you appraise that evidence, and then allowing practitioners to make their own best clinical judgments. I also appreciate how you seem to be hyper aware of the vicious cycle of overhyped and oversold pharmaceutical interventions that tend to fade in effectiveness and safety over time. You really do provide such an important service, and it is one of, if not the best, in my opinion, source of information out there for prescribers. So thank you, and thanks for coming on the podcast today. How's everything going?
Well, thank you, Ethan. I really appreciate hearing that. It's all going well here. I'm coming to you from New York City.
Oh, nice. Okay. Tell us a little bit about how you got from Yale and then Duke and Cornell to, well, I guess where you currently practice and your professional kind of trajectory.
Yeah, so I think the main pivot point in my professional trajectory, to back up a minute, before I went into medicine, I was in the arts. I did literary magazines and poetry and a lot in the arts scene. Well, many of my friends had mood disorders. I didn't know it. I thought they were just eccentric and creative, but they would spend an entire week in bed and then be up all night. Sometimes they'd go to the hospital. I thought they just needed escape. So it's kind of in parallel that with these friendships, I then went on to learn psychiatry. And they were really separate tracks in my mind. Again, like I didn't merge the two. But after I got out of residency, that was around 2003. There was a big rise in antidepressant and stimulant use at the time, and started to see some disasters in my personal life as people got on those. Then I took it. My first job was in college mental health. And so I was seeing a lot of the oldest millennials, the first millennials coming up in college. And, that generation had a lot of antidepressants as well in their teenage years. So basically, for my personal life and my professional life, I was seeing a lot of people getting worse on antidepressants and worrying about what we were doing. I was a big believer in them going through my training, but started to question that. So started just to dig into the research. And that's what I'd recommend for every young psychiatrist is find a question that's unanswered, find something in the field that you just don't think is going right, that just doesn't make sense. Like maybe it's long-term ketamine use, maybe it's something else, and dive into it. Just read everything you can. So I spent a few years doing that. And from that, figured out a lot of behavioral ways to help bipolar disorder and a lot of the medication pieces, and started a clinic specializing in that. So we grew to about 80 providers, therapists, and medication providers as well. I wrote some on that and took over the editorship of the Carlat report through all that kind of research that I was doing.
I mean, your story sounds like it has some similarities to Mogan Scow trying to help treat his brother who was suffering from manic depression, I believe back in the 40s or 50s, shortly after John Cade's kind of rediscovery of lithium in Australia. It seems like you had a similar kind of personal touch with experiencing mental illness secondarily through your friends.
Yeah, exactly. Hearing their stories and seeing what they were going through and trying to keep my boundaries, but also trying to guide them in the right direction was very educational. And if you have friends with mental illness, get to know them, because you're going to see a whole different side of the illness. As my patients have told me, I only know the part of them when they come in to see me. It's through the other part of my life that I got to know people who weren't coming in to see anyone and were out there on their own managing these symptoms, or maybe with a primary care doctor here and there. So I got to see how things look day and night with this.
Yeah, I mean, you certainly give off the impression in your podcast that you don't see mood disorders as these other people. And I really appreciate that. I think it really helps to destigmatize mental illness and recognize that it's not all bad, that there are certainly disordered elements. But as you said, you saw the creativity, the imagination in your friends. And so, I always say there are two sides to this. I'm not one of those that will say that there's nothing disordered about it, because clearly, if you've worked on enough inpatient psychiatry units, you see the disordered aspects. But I really appreciate that about you. And I've got to say, you have one of the best radio voices that I've ever heard. Like, maybe I need to start putting Carlat on at night as I'm trying to fall asleep. but but tell us a little bit about that history of involvement with the Carlat report initially, and then how you eventually took over as editor in chief of the Carlat report. I think it was in 2018.
Right. So Danny Carlat, who's been a great leader of unbiased and broad content in psychiatry, he asked me to guest edit a issue on the bipolar spectrum. And so I did that. Then he asked me to serve on the editorial board, which I did. And then he asked me to be editor. So it all happened very quickly. And meanwhile, in parallel to this, I want to thank my co-author, Jim Phelps, who helped me with my first book. And Jim has been a real leader in disseminating scientific information to the public. He believes that patients have as much right to know all the studies as doctors do, and much need. So he's been explaining that on his website for many years. And he and I partnered together to put out a book. And he taught me to speak in a more casual, formal, conversational tone. That was his great gift to me, which as a doctor, you don't talk in that, you don't write in that tone. So that's was a great gift that Jim gave. And he's still at it. He's semi-retired, but he runs a smaller version of his website now and still going strong with it.
Well, it is such an invaluable resource as you just present information and inject appropriate skepticism when there's questions about the methodology or limitations to the study findings. It seems like you operate with a pretty healthy and open appreciation of uncertainty. I hear you say, I'm not sure and I don't know regularly, which shows me that you're legit and probably on the right end of the Dunning-Kruger curve. The honest truth is that we're working in a field with a lot of unknowns. I think we have to take that into account when calculating somewhat nebulous benefit to risk ratios. But before we delve into specifics, I'm curious to hear about your general approach to evaluating data and research. How do you decide what's legit, what may be overly influenced by pharmaceutical interests and funding, and then how do you go about making clinical decisions based on the research when oftentimes there's multiple groups of high profile researchers disagreeing on how to assess and evaluate the same set of data?
That's a great question. And you're talking about how we can be certain about what we read. So we all can read things. We can read that such and such causes cancer, and that's great. But what we really want to know is how certain are we about that? And of course, how common is it to cause cancer? So in terms of certainty, we're going to get the best evidence from trials that are placebo controlled. And hopefully these subjects were not able to guess if they got the placebo. That's been a problem with, say, the ketamines and the psychedelics, that most people can guess which version they got. Hopefully it's a double-blind study so that both the researchers and the subjects didn't know which one they were assigned to, and again, weren't able to guess. Hopefully it's a fairly big trial, and there's not an exact number there. It depends on how powerful the treatment is. So a really powerful treatment, you can get away with a smaller trial. But in general, we want to see at least 100 people to be somewhat certain of it. I'm going to pause there to say that in the background of this uncertainty is not just the fact that if I run a trial with 18 people, it increases the risk that I'm going to get a false result, just because likewise, if I roll the dice twice and get 2 6s, that doesn't mean I'm going to get 100 6s. That could be a false pattern. But there's something else at play beyond that, which is intuitive to all of us who've rolled dice. There's the publication bias. So what's really going on in the world is that you got like 50 researchers running a trial with 18 people, and most of those dice rolls turn out kind of blah. So why bother? Why send it in for publication? Why write it up? So the publication bias is that only the one who rolled all 6s randomly is going to send them in. So we think about that as we're looking at it and interpreting the study size. Then we want to make sure that it's a pretty low dropout rate, that the people who enrolled in the trials were all assessed throughout it. And there, a rough number is 20%. If you're getting more than 20% dropout, which unfortunately might be the case if it's borderline personality or substance use disorders, then you're just not as sure of it. Another big one is the primary outcome positive? Now, this is a weird one because on this one, I'm going to ask you to not believe your own eyes. So when you look at the study, you might see, there's no change in depression. But if I look at this subset of depression ratings, just the remission rate, there's a change. And if I look at the anxiety ratings, there's a change. So it must be doing something. And I'm asking you not to believe what you're reading, because if the primary outcome was something else, then those other findings are secondary outcomes. And what that means is they might be a blur. They might be a random statistical flux. So really what I'm asking you to believe in this statement is that science and research studies are not about what you see. What you see, what you read is not certain. These are really statistical tests. So to really believe that these are statistical tests, they're subject to the laws of statistics, to the bell curve and all that, then you're going to have to only trust the primary outcome. Now, you already know that from playing pool, because if you play by the rules I follow, when you get to the 8-ball, you have to name which pocket it's going to go in. And if I name that left corner and sink it, you think, well, Chris is a really good player. If I name the left corner and sink it somewhere else, you think, he's a lucky guy, but not a great player. Lucky guy. So we don't want trials. That's what a secondary outcome is, where you get it on the wrong outcomes. And the way to interpret secondary outcomes is to wait for more research. They're really signals to researchers saying, hey, maybe next time you could look at these things and see if it holds up. Look at the anxiety, because this med didn't help depression, but maybe it'll help anxiety. So we're waiting for more trials on that kind of thing. A great example of this is the genetic testing, because pharmacogenetic panels in psychiatry look relatively good if you only look at the secondary outcomes. So these companies ran like 8 outcomes, and on their advertisements, they only publish on the cover the secondary outcomes. The primary outcomes, which are all negative, and all these trials were buried. You know, those genetic tests are also a great example of why we need the double blind, because every genetic test was positive and making a difference when patients were aware that they got the test. When patients were blinded to whether they got the test, they're all negative. So that increased enthusiasm about the test makes a big difference. So those are the basics. I'm also going to look at, is the finding replicated? Are there other studies showing it? The FDA likes to have 2 studies. And is it backed by basic science? That's kind of asking the question, how believable is this to begin with? And there we can have some false things, like doctors used to think that negative air ionizers did not help depression. They're popular as air purifiers. So they used them as a placebo, and to their surprise, they worked just as well as the treatment. So eventually they had to study the air ionizers and realize, hey, we don't know how this works, but it actually helps depression. So we're not always right on the backed by science, but I do like to see that there's some animal model or something that suggests this is plausible.
I'm curious, for even some of the clinical considerations or guidelines that you follow or adhere to most tightly, where would you put your degree of confidence with some of those assertions clinically that you feel really confident about? Are they 100%, or is it a little bit less than 100%? Is there still some uncertainty even about those aspects of how you practice that you're most certain about?
Yes, definitely. And a great example is, does a given patient have bipolar disorder or not? And I don't consider bipolar disorder to be a thing. Things
Love
are
that.
things you can see. Again, I already asked you, don't believe what you see, because I consider bipolar disorder to be a statistical concept that people more or less fit to. So
Kind of like a bell curve.
yeah, like a bell curve in a way, and they more or less fit to it. And another way of putting that is, rather than think how certain I am that something is true, I've just changed the definition of truth to be a statistical concept. So there never is any total truth. Instead of asking, is someone bipolar or not? Is this medication working or not? I don't ask that. I just ask, what is the likelihood? How well do they fit? And I'll go over that one with you, because that happens in practice every day. I think it's a great, really hard to answer question with any patient. Is their medication working? Most of us just ask the patient, go on with it. I look at 4 variables. One is their rating scale, usually self-rated. So are the numbers changing? 2 is what they say, just asking them, their subjective report. Yeah, I feel better on this medicine. 3 is what their families say. If they're not there, I'll say, well, what have other people said about how you're doing? Or if your wife was here, what would she say? And 4 is what I think, my general impression, which is usually based on the mental status. So you know how it is. Sometimes people will come in and they just look different, and you get a different vibe from them. So I think, yeah, there's a difference here. So I look at those 4, kind of the 4 legs of the chair. Now, you could throw in other things like, is there a functional difference? But I really just run that through the 4 legs. Like, does the wife think there's a functional difference? Do I think? So it's the same 4 views. And what's fun in practice is, rarely do all 4 views align. There's often ambiguity. So that just makes it all interesting and more to explore.
Really appreciate that viewpoint. I mean, again, I'm young in my career, but I've got about a decade of experience working in mental health at this point. And people don't fit into these neat little labels of psychiatric illness. There seems to be so much overlap between different conditions and such different phenotypic expression of symptoms just within something that we call bipolar disorder. Just for listeners, this what used to be termed manic depression, and nobody had to ever be manic to fit into that manic depressive illness spectrum. I think that change in classification, I believe it was 1981 with DSM-4, when we started to use bipolar disorder instead of manic depression. I think that is something that has been so detrimental to our field because it emphasizes that we shouldn't use mood stabilizers for patients who suffer from a similar looking depression as those who also may become manic at times. And now we've kind of tailored in this whole era of SSRI use for those patients, especially when we're using those drugs in young people who have not yet declared whether or not they will have a tendency towards mania or hypomania. I think that is just so dangerous. And it speaks to another issue that, like, you're an absolute hero of mine because of this. You talk so much about how underutilized lithium is in world psychiatry, but especially here in the United States, and especially in the treatment of mood disorders, where it's without a doubt the absolute gold standard first line treatment. I think that the evidence on that is pretty indisputable, or at least a 95+% confidence interval. But you've got the bipolar population dying on average a decade earlier than the general population due to comorbidities like diabetes, obesity, and metabolic syndrome, lung and heart disease, substance use, along with the consequences of untreated manic depression. But those on lithium die at the same age as the general population. Despite this, 20 years ago in the U.S., Baldessarini and et al. Found that lithium was prescribed as the initial drug for only 7.5% of bipolar patients. And I believe I saw something more recently that I believe you put out that said 1 in 40 new bipolar diagnoses receive a lithium prescription as the first line treatment. Why do you think lithium, a natural element that we ingest and tolerate daily at low doses, and is recognized as an essential trace element by the World Health Organization, is so underutilized?
Disclaimer. This podcast is for informational purposes only. The information provided in this podcast and related materials are meant only to educate. This information is not intended as a substitute for professional medical advice. While I am a medical doctor and many of my guests have extensive medical training and experience, nothing stated in this podcast nor materials related to this podcast, including recommended websites, texts, graphics, images, or any other materials, should be treated as a substitute for professional, medical, or psychological advice, diagnosis, or treatment. All listeners should consult with a medical professional, licensed mental health provider, or other healthcare provider if seeking medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment.
Or, put more simply,
If you need help like this guy, call your own doctor.
Thanks again for watching and or listening. If you're passionate about the subjects that I discuss on the channel, do me a favor and like, comment, subscribe, do whatever you can to make your voice heard, that these are problems that must be addressed in our society. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, I want to hear them. Feel free to reach out on social media or email us at renegadepsych@gmail.com. And if you'd like to be a guest of the show, or you have a connection to somebody that you think would be a good guest, let us know. Thanks again for listening.